this mic from you for a second. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you all for your patience here. My name is Amali and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to dive into the horrors of Through the Night Like a Snake. But before we get started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, our three guests will be signing and personalizing books right up here where they're sitting. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Through the Night Like a Snake online using the link in the live stream description. Now, let's get into this. This collection is full of strange encounters, bone-chilling creatures, and shocking discoveries written by some of the most exciting, compelling voices in contemporary Latin American literature and in collaboration with some of today's most prolific translators. To celebrate this creepy collection and discuss all things horror in translation, I'm so excited to introduce Lina Munar Guevara, Julia Sanches, and Megan McDowell. Lina Munar Guevara is a writer and lawyer from Bogota, Colombia, and author of the novel Imagina que rompes todo, Imagine Breaking Everything. She has written stories for Colombia Diversa based on testimonies from LGBTQI victims of the Colombian armed conflict. And she is now completing an MFA in creative writing at New York University. Julia Sanches is a translator of Portuguese, Spanish, and Catalan. Her shorter translations have appeared in various magazines and periodicals, including Words Without Borders, Granta, Tin House, and Guernica. A founding member of City & Co., Julia sits on the Council of the Authors Guild. And lastly, we have Megan McDowell here as a acting moderator for tonight's event. Megan has translated work by many of the most important contemporary Latin American writers, including Samantha Schweblin, Alejandro Zambra, and Mariana Enriquez, among others. Her translations have won numerous awards, including the National Book Award, the Shirley Jackson Prize, and 2 O. Henry Prizes, and have been short or longlisted 4 times for the International Booker Prize. Her short story translations have been featured in The New Yorker, Harper's, The Paris Review, Tin House, McSweeney's, and Granta, among others. Okay, that is all from me. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Lina, Julia, and Megan.
Hi, thank you guys all for coming out tonight, and thanks to Books Are Magic for hosting. Thank you very much, obviously, to the Center for the Art of Translation. Can y'all hear me? Okay. So yes, I'm going to be sort of moderating tonight, which may or may not be necessary. My strategy when it comes to stuff like this, book launches and all, is, we're all here to talk about a book that you guys by definition haven't read. So I don't really want to go too much into depth about the actual stories because I'm assuming that you guys are going to read those next. So I just wanted to talk about, some of the experiences of writing, some of the experiences of translating and reading and all of that as it relates to horror, specifically in Latin America. So my first question for both of you guys is, do you believe in ghosts?
Ooh.
Do you believe in the supernatural? Are you superstitious? Do you have a ghost experience that you can share with us?
Oh, should I? Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Well, first, I'm very excited to be here, and thank you all for coming. And that's a very good question. I do believe in ghosts. Well, I like to believe in a world where ghosts can be a thing. But I also think anything can turn into a ghost in a way in which love can turn into a ghost, or like war, or like nostalgia. So I'm very drawn to that idea of like hunting, of like what becomes a ghost to you, right? It might not be a person, it might be an idea, it might be a regret, it might be a love story. So I do like ghosts in many of their senses. And I do feel like growing up in Latin America, you get a lot of like superstitions as part of your day to day. I mentioned briefly, but some of the things I included in my story are based on family stories. My mom, who is right here, her share of paranormal stories. So I feel like all of that makes the world a little bit more interesting too. Not only like your literary world, but in general.
Mm-hmm. What about you?
My answer is going to be a lot less interesting, but I grew up with my mother always saying, and she attributed this to her grandmother, who was from Spain and immigrated to Brazil in like the 1930s. And so my mother would say that her grandmother said, "Yo no creo en brujas, pero que existen, existen," which I think you can apply to ghosts as well. That sort of means I don't believe in witches, but que existen is a difficult rhetorical device to translate, but it's essentially, but they exist.
They definitely
They definitely exist. And so I think that's how I feel about ghosts. Agnostic, perhaps, which is a bit more generous than how I feel about God. Agnostic toward ghosts, atheist.
Yeah,
Rest of
yeah.
things. But I'm curious to hear your response, because I have a dear friend of mine in Rhode Island who's actually from Kentucky.
Oh.
Louisville?
Louisville.
Yeah.
Louisville.
And she believes deeply in ghosts and actually deeply in hates.
Really?
Yes. And is constantly saying that her dog found a ghost somewhere in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel about ghosts?
Well, I'm kind of the opposite of your grandmother, I think. When I moved to Chile, I started realizing that almost everybody has a story, a supernatural thing that has happened to them. And I really love listening to those stories. Like, I got really into it to the point where I would ask people, it was like one of my getting to know you questions, like, oh, where are you from? Do you believe in ghosts? And because everyone always gives a really interesting answer. And I do not believe in ghosts, but I really want to be proven wrong. And I've like actively tried to seek out situations in which I could be proven wrong. Like I lived in a couple supposedly haunted places in Chile, one where my room looked out over a cemetery, and another one that had a weird backstory. And, I really wanted to have my ghost experience. And I love reading ghost stories and horror stories, because of there's that moment where you're in suspense and you're like, what's going to happen now? Like the rug's being pulled out from under me, and you're trying to figure things out, like, how can this be happening? And I love that moment. And I have always wanted to have that moment in real life, where like all the rules that you are used to in reality turn out to maybe not be right. But I think I'm way too logical. Like I think I'm very I don't think a ghost is going to appear to me, because I don't really believe. I'm just like waiting to be proven wrong, and that's not how ghosts work.
Ghosts that you don't believe in don't work
Exactly.
that way.
Yeah. So, in terms of you as a writer, we talked about this a little beforehand, but I was wondering if you think of yourself as a horror writer, or how you came to write the story that we have in the anthology today.
No, very funny enough. Like I've written like one horror story, and it's here. But I like to write about anything, and I like to, like, I would like to write something in every genre, like something historical, something fantasy, something for children, drama, comedy. I write a lot of fiction. I like novels in general. But I feel like you learn so much, or like, I don't know, I would like to like write it all. And this one in particular was a result of a writing workshop where the last assignment was writing a horror story. So, maybe without that, I wouldn't have like written it by myself, maybe. But it was very interesting to like have that challenge, and then like we had a very cool conversation about like what scares you, what do you like in the abstract, what do you fear, and then how do you translate that into something tangible or intangible, but how do you take that to a story? So no, I'm not a horror writer, but I can be when I want to.
And are you a horror reader?
I feel like I'm more of a horror reader than I am as a writer. I feel like I enjoy the same feeling that you describe of like that tension and like wondering, because it's very hard to do like scaring people. So when you like sit down to read, I feel like part of me is like letting herself like go and enjoy the horror. Another part of me is like taking notes on like, oh, this is how they did it. But I do enjoy reading horror, mainly short stories, and watching occasional horror movies.
One more question about your story. When I was reading it, I had the sense that a lot of the moments are maybe stories that people have told you in real life. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I write and I steal. I steal a lot. But I feel like every writer steals.
Oh, yeah.
But no, it's true. I feel like there's a lot of like superstition. I feel like Colombia is a very Catholic country. And in its own, I feel like Latin American Catholicism has a very like unique flavor to it, in which it like joins a lot of like superstition, and there's some like magic, and there's witches, and there's like spells, and like there's a lot of stories permeate like the day to day. And I do have like in the story there's a character who says that she can smell when someone is about to die, and it smells like daffodils, and that is something that my aunt said once. And I was like, that's great. And stolen. But I feel like all the time you're constantly hearing stories or ideas or superstitions, or like a friend of a friend, this happened. So yeah, and I pieced a lot of them together in the story.
Are you a horror reader?
Absolutely not.
Oh, really? Okay.
I am a scaredy cat. Cannot watch scary movies. The story that I co-translated in this by Claudia Hernandez, I wasn't sure counted as horror.
Yeah, it's got probably the most humor of any of the stories in the anthology.
Yeah, it's got like the vague menace, but Claudia Hernandez is really good at telling things at a sort of slant, so that she does make even, at least in her short stories, that she does make even slightly horrifying things kind of funny, and then you're like, oh God, why am I laughing? But I can't watch scary movies, because then I carry the fear around me, the dread around me for like a week, and like life in America is scary enough.
Yeah. I have several follow-up questions to that. But first of all, tell me more about working with Claudia and because this isn't the first story you've done with her. You translated her novel. What's your relationship like, and what are the kinds of questions that you ask in this story and in the novel?
So this story was co-translated with Johanna Warren, who I found out recently is also a really cool musician. She reached out to me in the early days of the pandemic because she'd gotten an NEA to translate this collection of short stories by Claudia Hernandez. It's called De Fronteras, on borders. And she hadn't managed to place the collection at any point, and so she reached out to me to be like, let's work together, get to a translation that we're both happy with, and try to get it published. I have yet to get it published. I've been trying to pressure her UK publisher and other stories. But this one, I think because I was working with someone, I didn't really have any questions about the story. I think it's also fairly straightforward. Her novel, Rosa Tumba Quema, so many questions. It's a really difficult novel that's told in a very close third person, and it's constantly changing perspectives. happens almost seamlessly, but then suddenly you're in someone else's head, and it's all sort of about the Civil War in an unnamed Spanish-speaking country, but she's from El Salvador, so you sort of assume it's El Salvador. But the namelessness sort of makes it more universal, or at least more Latin American. The story that happened in El Salvador also happened in so many different places. And there's what is unspoken is really important, but sometimes when you're a translator, you have to be like, but what are you actually saying? Like, I need to understand this so much better than any reader will ever understand this so that I can convey what's happening. And she is a joy to work with. Like, I would send her long lists of questions. I'm someone who asks authors annoying quantities of questions, and she would send me, like, the book is based on, I think, at least a decade, possibly 2 decades of interviews that she did with women who were in the guerrilla, and at sort of their experience after the war was over. Part of the point of the book is that the war never actually ended, and these women sort of still carried it with them. And there were specific things that the guerrillas would, like, use to sleep on, and she would send me pictures so that I could really know what it meant. She's also writes in a different Spanish than I'm used to, El Salvadoran Spanish, whereas I grew up learning Mexican Spanish. So there are also, like, those questions, which I'm sure you've encountered having translated authors from from Mexico all the way south.
I've never translated.
You've never
Mexican.
done Mexico?
Right now I'm working on my first Mexican writing.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. It's Brenda Navarro, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I already have a lot of questions. But I also wanted to go back to what you were talking about before, you know, because a lot of people, I've heard many people say similar things that, you know, why would we read horror when the real world is horrible enough? And I think, you know, there are 2 kinds of people in this world. No, I'm kidding. But there are people who eschew horror for that reason, and there are others who see horror as a way of, you know, of expiating or of coming to terms with it in a way. Like Mariana oftentimes says that, you know, if you take the historical events that have influenced her writing, which is a lot of the dictatorship and state violence, and you put it into the language of horror, it returns the visceral nature to it. Because a lot of times, you know, a lot of times we become inured to violence, and it becomes almost normalized. And we just go on with our lives. And then if you take it out of, you know, the newspaper and put it into this, you know, gory context, it returns the force to it. So I think those are 2 different and valid ways of thinking about it. And I guess my question is just, what do you think about that?
Well, I really want to know first if you read horror, aside from, like, meticulously reading Mariana, for example.
You know, when I was a kid, I read a lot of horror. Like, that was one of the things that I first started reading. You know, I read R.L. Stine as a little kid, and then I started reading my dad's Stephen King books and that kind of horror. And I probably read it too early because I was kind of doing it in secret. And then I started reading, you know, literature, and I kind of moved away from it. And now that I've been translating more horror, it's let me combine my, like, love for horror with my love for literature, and now it's, you know, it's no longer a guilty pleasure. It's like, this is me. This is who I am, you know. I am a person who, I do love horror. I love to watch horror movies. You know, I love to be scared by them. So I think I belong to that camp of people, of readers who, like, I feel like reading horror it takes what happens in a lot of literature and makes it more extreme, in the sense that when a book can surprise you, when you don't know where it's taking you, when it kind of pushes your boundaries. I think horror does that in a very obvious and almost atavistic way. Like it digs down into something primitive. And that's why I like it. But I totally understand that I understand people being more squeamish and just not liking to look at the blood.
If I can jump on that, I
Please
think
do.
it's interesting because I also work a lot of with human rights, right? So like most of the time, real life is way more horrifying. Like what you read, like more like in that realm of like, you know, court testimonies or like survivors' accounts or just like the facts of a war. It's so cold to the language and like the horrors that it has, and they're real. And then you read all of that, and it's very hard to stomach, you know, or I find it very hard to stomach. And then I feel like when you read a horror story, the beautiful thing is that like the writers can kind of work with it and like through language and through like just like creativity, like turn it into something that's a little bit easier, like to confront. In a weird way, I find it like easier to confront through fiction and through like, you know, like whatever writers do or like, or even in movies, what film directors do to turn that real fears into like, there's like a work put into them, and I find that like easier to deal with in a way than when you have to deal with those real life horrors, because it's true. It's like the world is scary. It's very scary out there. So I feel like like sometimes fiction can even elevate in a way that it's like more thoughtful and more reflective and make it a little bit easier to confront than, you know, real life, which is depressing. Like never read anything, like any judicial ruling about human rights violations, because it's horrifying. But I feel like that's like very two different like forms of language, and you know the more artistic one has its like ways to make it easier. I think.
Yeah, I can see that. So this isn't just a horror anthology, it's a Latin American horror anthology. So, you know, I guess I want to ask a few questions. One is if you think that horror is having a particular day, let's say, in Latin America as a whole, and maybe in the particular traditions that we come from or know about. And how those play differently maybe in Spanish and English. I think a lot about, you know, there's a book that Stephen King wrote about, it's called Dance Macabre, about horror. And he talks about phobic pressure points, like national phobic pressure points, where, you know, the things that inspire fear and you consciously or unconsciously often have to do with, you know, psychological issues, economic issues, political issues, not necessarily the supernatural. And I think you can see that a lot in Mariana's story that I translated in a lot of her fiction. And when I compare it to some of the horror stories that have affected me and from the English-speaking world, like, you know, I think if you look at Get Out, for example, it's very specific to racism in the United States, right? Or Carrie, which is very specific to the high school experience in the United States. It could not have been written in Argentina. And conversely, Mariana's story takes place in kind of the aftermath of the dictatorship, in this world in which childhood has its own particular kind of horror, because there's no future, and you're just kind of living in this present that you have no control over, And when you look ahead, you don't know what's going to happen, and there's so much unknown and so much that's mysterious that it kind of lends itself to horror in a very particular way. So what does that inspire in you? That's a cop-out question. But what do you think about, if you were to make a generalization about horror in Latin America today, what generalizations would you make?
So the thing I struggle with here is that I guess thinking about horror as a genre versus what is horrifying, because I just finished translating this book with Heather Cleary by Dalia de la Cerda, which is called Reservoir Bitches, out in September. And central to this collection of short stories is femicide. But, there's a story where one of the characters gets brutally raped and murdered and then turns into like the undead or a vampire and then gets revenge. I don't know if that counts as horror though.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty horror-y.
Yeah, but like, for example, I've read Crime, and I have, embarrassingly, everyone's mother-in-law's taste in television. Like, give me British true crime any day. It's terribly embarrassing. And that does the same thing as horror in the sense that it takes like these horrifying things that you don't read about in the news and it makes it palatable and solvable almost. Like, it just, you know that at the end of the day you are safe in your little cocoon, and that the great thing, sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself, but the great thing about British crime is that the cops are always corrupt. And so it's not like the glorifying of the police officer figure that you get in a lot of American crime shows. But, that I can stomach, I think, because I'm not being... Horror films, I feel manipulated.
Interesting.
Like, there is the loud cupboard and I jump 10 feet into the air. But yeah, femicide is one thing. Sorry, I went on a huge tangent. But femicide, I think, is one thing that feels very crucial to at least Mexico. And in my experience, having translated Dolores Reyes, Earth Eater, also centers on like the rampant murder of children and girls and women. And so that feels like something Latin America, that is haunting Latin America, if we want to talk about ghosts again.
Also that. It's a great answer, because I do feel like what's horrifying has never left Colombian literature, I would say. I mean, I also feel like a little bit shy making generalizations, because sometimes it's I don't know if I know. But I would say that the horrifying never left. The outcomes of war, the violence against women. There's always those traumas, the Latin American traumas, Colombian traumas are always permeating from poetry to novel to short stories. But then it's also hard to see is that the same as horror as a genre? Is it the same as these horror stories? I feel like it's interesting to compare, but I feel like the horror itself never left the stories. And I feel like we are in a very particular moment of post-conflict, and where there's a lot of questions of how do we tell the stories of what happened. And there's everyday horrors too, and I feel like I wanted to ask you too about speaking of different, I feel like different cultures have different traumas, and Latin America versus the US. How about conveying horror in the different languages, that process of horror in one language and then taking that to a different one? What challenges or how was that process?
So, the writer who I work with the most, the horror writer that I work with the most, is Mariana, whose story I translated for this collection, Mariana Enriquez. And she is well, she has she has certain challenges that arise a lot. She draws on a very specific Argentine tradition. You know, Argentina has, you know, Cortázar, Borges, Silvino Campo. I'm forgetting a lot, but Bioy Casares. So there's a very specific porteño tradition of the fantastic that she's drawing on. She's also drawing on very Anglo influences, like Stephen King, like Brontes, like you know, a lot of the Southern Gothic writers. So in a way, the language or the tradition is there for me because it's very Anglo influenced. In another way, she sets a lot of stories, you know, in the north of Argentina. She draws on Guarani languages and cultures, a lot of, you know, local mythologies. Sometimes, and she also, you know, invents mythologies. So there's always this question of what needs to be translated, you know, like which a lot of Guarani words that may be intelligible in Argentina, I need to kind of gloss or explain in English. And also with Mariana, her way of writing is very world building. You know, I have other writers who tell you exactly what you need to know and no more. But what Mariana does is pile on detail. She tells you, she lays out the world for you, whether it's a neighborhood, a building, like in this story, you know, a house. And a lot of my questions to Mariana have to do with figuring out the choreography of a story. You know, where is something? And like I remember in this story, I had to ask exactly how the body was tied to the window. You know, like I had to picture it in my head. And so there are a lot of like very specific questions like that, because I feel like I need to know as much about the space and the way the characters move in that space as she does. You know, I need to be able to picture it as in my head as much as she does. And she also has layers of very sensory detail. So there's a lot of sound, a lot of taste, smell. And I feel like a lot of the horror comes from that. Like there's one story where there's a creature that comes from the river and kind of squelches along behind. And that sound of the footsteps, the squelching footsteps, you know, like I want readers to be able to hear that. And that's kind of where the creepy part comes from. So those are the particular challenges that come from Mariana.
I was actually, I read your two stories on the train up, and I was just and I also follow Mariana on Instagram, and I'm just very basic. I've got Instagram, true crime, and she's always posting about American media.
Oh yeah.
Or like pictures of Cillian Murphy.
Oh yeah.
Loves Cillian Murphy.
She does.
And I always think it's you have like a different challenge when you're bringing in authors who are so influenced by American fiction. It almost feels like, well, this is probably not the case with Mariana, but I have this author I work with called Carol Ben-Simon, who's Brazilian but lives in California and reads so much American fiction, and she translates from English into Portuguese. And sometimes I feel like bringing her into English is like, this is where you should have been all along. Like, you're almost writing in Portuguese is an accident of birth. You know, you grew into this language, but really you're writing you're writing North American fiction. I was at the Brown Translation Conference a couple of weeks ago where Anton Hur was the keynote. And he talked, I think in response to a question, he described genre as gender, like marketing. Genre is marketing. So I don't know about translating different traditions. I might just be a very lazy translator, and I'm like, just do the work. And
this doesn't go beyond this room. We're all friends here.
We're all friends here. I mean, lazy in the sense that I want the reader to do the work. I don't think that what we translate has to be transformed so that American readers can understand it, like, to a huge extent. We have to convey what's on the page and the experience of reading it, but we're not going to give you an entire literary tradition. Like, you have to bend yourself to the book rather than have the book bend to you, is how I feel about translation.
Yeah, I think you can trust the reader.
Yeah. I feel like in publishing, people are always thinking the readers are dumber than they are, and I hate
Yes,
that
that's
attitude.
true. Yeah.
Readers are intelligent, and also they all have smartphones and Google.
That's an interesting dissertation right there. How has Wikipedia changed translation?
Honestly, though, yeah.
We don't have time for that now. This is the time where we open it up for questions from the audience, if y'all have those. Yes.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I'm a senior at McDowell, and a lot of my academia has been focused on Latin America, specifically the dictatorships in Argentina and Chile. And something I've noticed in studying both in the countries and from afar is the presence of collective trauma as well as collective memory, and how that kind of like manifests itself through literature. I think in particular about Mariana Enriquez's short story Cuando Hablamos con los Muertos. And I was wondering what your guys' opinion was on literature kind of being a way, particularly for people to kind of cope and address the history of the past few decades.
So the question is about how literature is a way. I'm restating this for the how literature, in particular horror, can be a way of processing and dealing with the past, with dictatorships of the recent past. Is that okay? There's another doctoral dissertation right there. I think I'll start and then I'll throw it to you guys. I think that I've had a lot of experience in that because I work with Chilean writers, namely Alejandro Zambra, who kind of started this idea of children of dictatorship, or the literature of the children, right? Literature of the children, and he comes from a tradition of an authorial voice, right? And when he started writing, this is all too much of a generalization, but kind of trying to find a voice that wasn't dictatorial, that wasn't dogmatic, and that did speak in a kind of a collective way, hence the literature of the children, de los hijos. And it was more fragmented. It was more the story of the secondary characters, not the people who are in the streets fighting wars, but the kids who are making paper boats in the corner, and they kind of know something's going on and they're aware of the silence, but they're not active participants. So there's been that current in Chile, right? Alejandro kind of started it, and then there are other people who put their own spin on it. And then you have in Argentina a totally different direction with Mariana. I'm speaking from the writers that I've translated, because she's also dealing with, she's also a child of the dictatorship. She's also dealing with that legacy and that, cultural trauma, but she takes it in a totally different direction. But she also uses a lot of times that collective voice, where, like in the one that you mentioned, she focuses a lot on children and teenagers, right? She has another story called Our Lady of the Quarry in English, where it's told in a we, and we don't know how many people constitute that we. It's a group of teenage girls, and it's just, for the first half of the story, it's just we. And she has been kind of fascinated with that the kind of fandom and the experience of being part of this kind of an obsession that drives you, and a lot of times it's the teenagers who maybe follow a band or follow or experimenting with the Ouija board in that story, or are going through puberty. There's another one where there's a girl who's realizing that she's a lesbian, but all of them are also affected by the trauma of the dictatorship. You know, they're communicating with the spirits who died, or they're haunted by the ghosts of the dictatorship. But it is really interesting to see those two different paths, because obviously there are exceptions to this, and I shouldn't make generalizations, but I'm going to. In Chile, I see much more of a kind of auto-fiction or, you know, realistic trend. And in Argentina, there's more of like a fantastical and playing with the boundary between real and supernatural that's very pronounced in my mind. I don't know. That was a long answer. What do you guys think?
Well, I feel like in Colombia, more than dictatorship, there's still like that. The scars are like civil war and like armed conflict in general. And I feel like literature and art in general are kind of like the ideal way to like, well, I'm very biased too because I write, but I feel like having one foot in like the law and having one foot in the arts, you know, like the record, the files and files that we have with like stories of victims, of like the massacres, few people are gonna read that, and like even fewer can understand them because legal jargon is its own thing. But like when you read something that's a short story or a song or a poem, you know, it's a completely different way of like approaching the conflict and its scars. So I think the arts are way more powerful than like the official records. And specifically in Colombia, we're like in that post-conflict moment of like, there's a lot of fighting of like, how are we going to look back and understand what happened and what versions are gonna come out strong versus which ones are going to be silenced. And I think the question there is like, who gets to tell what story, right? Because the people who can get like sit down and just write are few and privileged, versus like the people who live this like the horrors of war. You know, like first of all, many of them didn't even make it. Then like who gets to like sit around? Who has the time? Who has the education? Who has like the means to tell that story? So I feel like as a medium, it's ideal to tell all of these stories, but it's also important to ask like who gets to tell them and how.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
I'm not topping that. I'm just gonna.
Do we have any other questions?
I know you all said you believe in ghosts a lot, but I was wondering if you could share, in the spirit of the conversation, something that scares you.
Yeah, that was a question I didn't get to. That's a good one. So the question is if we could all share something that scares us. Okay.
How much time do you have? Sharks, planes, the next election. There's more. I'm blanking right now.
Also so many, but I feel like something that scares me a lot is like losing control over your body, like with age or with illness or whatever. Like that is, I feel like that's very scary. Or the supernatural. I feel like there's a lot of witchcraft stories in Colombia, and maybe like I wouldn't mess with that. And in a more like abstract level, and you're gonna see it in the story, in many of my stories, but I'm not obsessed with it. I feel like the idea of like eternity, I find very scary, or like something that doesn't end, like the limitless. Yeah.
I'm very frightened of public speaking.
Oh.
So there's that. And I, not to get too serious about it, but I'm scared of, losing people who are important to me. I have a twin sister who has existed, since before I was born. And, I feel like I wouldn't know how to live if she didn't exist. And I think I'm definitely scared of swimming where I can't see the shore, and of centipedes.
Centipedes.
I hate centipedes.
But are you scared of them? Or do you hate them? Like, do they gross you out? Or are
Okay,
you
so
scared
this
of
is
them?
what's the difference between being scared and disgusted? I think I'm disgusted by centipedes, yeah. Oh, and going blind. I have nightmares about going blind. Yeah. So, yes.
I think like sometimes horror can be like comedy in a way where like some people get the joke and some people don't, and horror can be cultural in that sense. Like what is scary for some people is not scary for others because of history, and we now know that like things like trauma are like coded into people's DNA and things like that. So I'm wondering, since we are like on the topic of like horror in Latin America, like I don't know, I don't really know what my question is. Like I just came up with something like 2 seconds ago. But I was also just sort of like, maybe it was the Get Out like comment, like race is scarier for other, like something like that is scarier for other groups of people obviously than others. So I was just wondering, like, you know, how do you decide what is scary and like what, and then what is not? Like, I guess even in like maybe the editing process, like if you're writing something, if you're writing a horror story too.
So the question is, horror is a little like humor that some people get it, some people get the joke and some people don't, and it's also culturally specific in a lot of senses. So if we think about the Get Out, you know, that's a specific kind of American horror, and so the question is kind of how do you decide what's scary? Which is a great question. How do you decide what's scary? And I think that, you know, the Get Out example to me is, and Carrie to a certain extent, those to me are really good examples because those stories are true in the sense that they convey the horror of racism, right? And they make you feel that horror in a way that just talking about it doesn't. Right, and I think that that's what horror does when it's at its best. And you know, when you think about these, what the cultural pressure points, I think when you're writing horror, or really maybe anything, you're trying to connect the specific and the universal, and you're trying to kind of do this dance where you find what those kind of psychological pressure points are and then push on them, you know. And I think of, so I translated one book, Distancia de Rescate, Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin. And that's a book that has a pretty specific context. Like one thing that she's talking about in that book is the use of pesticides in Argentina and the effects that has on people. But it's also talking about a fear that almost everyone can relate to, even if you haven't had children, which is you can't protect your children from the evils of the world. And so kind of that's what I mean when I'm talking about the specific and the universal, you know. I think any effective horror story will kind of push on those two things, like something that's universal and something that's maybe culturally specific, or, well, let's just say specific. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that you start with your own fears, you know, because it's like what you feel viscerally. And then a good story is going to make the reader afraid of that, even if they had never thought about like centipedes before. Maybe after reading Megan's story, you're going to be terrified of them. And I do think it's because of that, because fear, it's it's universal. Like what makes us scared is unique to each one, but like the feeling of fear is a universal experience, I think. So I think a good story, like how Get Out lands for some people versus others. Of course, it's gonna be more personal and more urgent for some. But in the end, even if you're not living like as a black person in the U.S., watching Get Out can give you an idea of how scary that can be. And I think that's the power of those stories, of a good story that makes you scared and makes you feel, get new fears in a good way.
Yeah, that's good.
I think maybe that's where questions of craft come into it as well. Like there's a sort of pacing that happens in horror, you know, a building of suspense, a revealing of information, and the words you use to describe that centipede that is going to haunt Megan. Like, I feel like there is a horror movie out there that has made bunny rabbits terrifying, I'm sure.
Or a book, Cursed Bunny.
So even like,
Or actually Otto's piece. It's
Yeah.
called Rabbits.
well, there you go. Like even, I guess humanity is very perverse that we will even make bunny rabbits
I
terrifying.
mean, I think bunnies are pretty scary.
Really?
Yeah. They have red eyes. And
I have a friend here who thinks seals are terrifying, and I'm like, but baby seals, they're so cute. How could you possibly be terrified of them? But she thinks that their eyes are voids. And so I think it's just, I mean, it's like any literature, it's conveying that in a successful way. And I guess when it comes to translation, sort of choosing words that are more charged, words that are more evocative. And that's something I find interesting about Latin American literature. And maybe I'm not allowed to ask questions. You are supposed to ask questions.
Someone asked. No.
well, we do have a question. Okay.
Going off of the last question, something I was wondering is, I've noticed like a lot of the horror novels that have come out of Latin America and been translated into English have been written by women. And I was wondering about just like as readers, writers, and translators of Latin American horror, like whether you've noticed there, because I've also noticed almost half of the stories in this collection seem to be written by men. And so I was wondering, one, if you find that you notice kind of a sort of like this different preoccupations from the writers depending on like their gender or what they're really concerned with in their horror writing.
I have an answer, but I want to give you guys a chance to.
I mostly translate women, so I'm not entirely sure.
I am a woman. No, I don't know. I think as a woman, as a Latin American woman, you learn fear very young. Like you live in fear in a lot of ways that I feel like sometimes men don't, or at least like traditionally masculine men, because feminine men have like a different story too. But I feel like that constant fear, and that fear also is like tied with survival and how much care you take of yourself. It's also like a thing that you like learn very early on. I don't know how exactly that translates to the writing, but I do feel like women have a very close relationship to fear and to like understand their own fear and like know when to listen to that fear and when to like not let that fear stop you. So I would imagine that in the stories, that special bond with fear, it's gonna show somehow. I feel like then the ways it shows is particular to any woman, but I do feel like it's a different relationship than men have to fear in general, in broad terms.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the idea that women write domestic stories, I think, is obviously not true. And I think horror is maybe a more natural language for women writers, because a lot of horror has to do with loss of control. And as women, you know, a lot of times we don't have control over our bodies. And that's like a very visceral thing. And so so I think it's natural that comes out as the language of women writers. But there's also, you know, overall across the board, there are more women writers being published in Latin America than there were 20 years ago. And there are more women writers being translated than there were 20 years ago or 10 years ago. So that's a difference in and of itself. Not all of them are writing horror, but a lot of them are. And then I think there might also be a marketing thing in there. You know, I think that readers are also interested in horror. I know I am, and I think that you know, once it's the same as anything. You know, once you have one writer, two writers doing horror, you're going to look around for the next one. So there might be a little an editorial hand in there too.
I agree with the editorial hand. I mean, I sometimes think that in publishing, editors can be a little bit like lemmings. They're like, ooh, Mariana Enriquez does horror. She does it really well. Let's find more women from Latin America who are doing horror. It happened when Han Kang won the International Booker. Everyone was like, Han Kang did The Vegetarian. Let's go get more Korean women. And that's really helpful, right? We want more. No, it's not a bad thing, but it also means that there are probably types of Latin American fiction that we are not getting in English because there isn't the same appetite, like because we've seen Samantha Schweblin and Mariana Enriquez be very, very successful in English. Thank you, Megan. We've had like more Latin American women published in that vein. But there's also, I think, a concern, like Latin American women are doing really well. They're writing awesome books and they're coming into English thanks to some of us. But there is like this sort of simmering menace underneath a lot of what is being published by women in Latin America, like Fernanda Melchor, Mariana Enriquez, Samantha Schweblin, Dalia de la Cerda. It's a huge concern, and I keep bringing it back to femicide, but it's been an enormous topic of conversation in politics for the last 10 years specifically, like abortion rights and femicide. You know, protecting women's bodily rights is something that is on everyone's minds, and I think is therefore in the literature as well.
Amen. So yeah, we need to wrap it up there. Thank you guys for listening and for your excellent questions. Thanks to you guys. Thanks to Books Are Magic, Center for the Art of Translation, Wizards, and happy reading.
Thank you.
There we go. Yeah, I'm here to first echo all of the thanks that Megan just gave. Thank you to everyone for coming out. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you for moderating this conversation. And thank you to all three of you for doing this very, very cool, very special event with us tonight. So just a couple final things before we wrap up. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy of Through the Night Like a Snake by clicking the link in the description. For those of you with us tonight, I believe we have 6 copies left. So if you haven't gotten it yet, head to the register fast. Don't run, don't trip, don't hurt yourself. But we have a couple copies left. We have 8 copies left, actually. So you don't have to run as fast. Thank you. Julia, Lina, and Megan will all be up here signing books. We're just going to shift everything over to the shelves a little bit. So we'll ask that you all line up down the center aisle and curve around, and we'll get these chairs cleared out of the way. We just ask that you please grab all of your personal belongings with you so that we can start to break down and rearrange the space. That is all we have for tonight. Thank you all again so much for coming. Let's give these 3 one last round of applause.